Okay, terrific. Thanks, Richard. Something I should have asked Gib before he went and had a baby, right? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I think we'd like to get started. I want to welcome you all to the Woodrow Wilson Center. My name is Jeff DeBelko. I'm fortunate enough to direct the Environmental Change and Security Program here at the center. And on behalf of Lee Hamilton and my colleagues here at the center, it's a tremendous opportunity and privilege to welcome you all to the center where we're going to discuss today troubled waters, anticipating, preventing, and resolving conflict around fisheries. I see a number of familiar faces, but some new ones, so I would love to just tell you a word about where you're sitting. President Wilson was our 28th president, our only president who had a PhD, and so Congress, when they decided how to memorialize him, thought a living institution that brought together the worlds of scholarship and policy would be most appropriate. So instead of building an obelisk on the mall for you all to go see as a tourist, they set up the Wilson Center as a living memorial where these two worlds come together. We've been doing that since 1968. The Environmental Change and Security Program has been specifically focusing on issues of environment, health, population development within a development, foreign policy, and security policy context since 1994 in facilitating meetings like this, putting out publications like some of the ones out on the desk that I hope you will pick up, and generally trying to be a resource for those of you who are working in this area and providing a forum to get together and discuss these issues that aren't necessarily readily available. I'm pleased to say that today's topic is one that we have in the recent years spent a lot of time on in fish, and it's great to see some of the folks from USAID who were instrumental in allowing us to focus a series of meetings on fisheries. But this is also, in some ways, in how we're trying to bring these different portfolios together. This is more formally the fourth meeting in a series that we've entitled New Horizons at the Nexus of Conflict, Natural Resources, and Health, which is funded by USAID, as are many of our programs in this project. Traditionally by the Office of Population and Reproductive Health, which is also the case today, but interestingly also collaboration with the Conflict Management and Mitigation Office, also the biodiversity folks in EGAT. So it's across the agency in ways and cooperating on topics in ways that don't often happen, and so it's terrific that they've come together and that we can come together around these issues because they are obviously highly connected. Let me say just very briefly about our two expert speakers that we're thrilled to have join us. You'll find lengthier bios for Chip Barber and Richard Polnack in the handouts along with the participants list. But we're thrilled that they're here. This is a meeting that we did have to reschedule because of illness, so it's terrific that we have been able to do it in really in such short order after our original April date. So Chip Barber is an environmental advisor with the Office of Environment and Science Policy at USAID, someone who was a recidivist here at the Wilson Center. I remember I started back in the mid-'90s, and it was in the mid-'90s that Chip was talking at the Wilson Center when we were in the Smithsonian Castle and talking about his Indonesia forest work and connections to conflict. And so it's terrific to have him back here at the center. And Richard Polnack is a professor of anthropology and marine affairs at University of Rhode Island. Has been chair of the Department of Marine Affairs since fall of 2007. And so with these two gentlemen, we have a tremendous amount of experience and knowledge and research and field-based research, particularly in Southeast Asia, but certainly not exclusively to that region. We have asked them to make two presentations to kick off this discussion, and we will for sure have a question and answer period after their two presentations. When it comes to that, because we are webcasting today's event live and also are going to have the archived video available online, we ask that you wait for one of my colleagues to bring you a microphone so that everyone in the room and everyone online can hear your question. One word of advice for those who are watching online, the PDF of the PowerPoint presentations is available on the website, and I urge you to open that up as you're watching or listening to the presentations because it'll be far easier to look at those rather than trying to see the screen on the television broadcast. So Richard, I'm going to turn the floor over to you, and then we'll have Chip, and then we'll have Q&A. So please, the floor is yours.
Where is it on here?
Let's see, I think it's one of these two.
Oh, okay, right down there. Good enough. I didn't see it. I thought it would be on the desktop.
Yeah, we got it hidden.
Okay, I'm going to be talking about cooperation and conflict between large and small-scale fisheries, a Southeast Asian example. And where is it best for me to stand with this behind me? Should I sit? Would it be better?
Here, why don't we pull this, and if you want to sit in the middle, and then you can easily reach the advance, or the forward keys.
Okay. Okay, the basic premises that underlie what I'm going to be talking about are, one, that Southeast Asians have a heavy reliance on fish for dietary protein. That goes without saying, and income generation. And we have in Southeast Asia at the present time rapid population growth. And along with this, there is limited land and economic opportunity, and the open access that is generally practiced with regard to marine resources, despite the fact that there are laws on the books, has resulted in an increased demand for fish and increasing numbers of fishers, and this has resulted in decreasing fish populations. Tomorrow, Agnes is going to be giving a presentation which has a diagram that shows the increase in population and the decrease in capture fisheries at the same time. Now, when you look at this model that I have up here, this rapid population growth, increasing fishing effort, all the things that I said about so far, that I talked about so far, is illustrated. And I put it in a model because there are relationships between all these variables. This is just summarizing what I originally said. What we have are people who are moving to the coast from inland where there are limited resources, and we have people residing along the coastline. And they're continuing to fish despite the fact that the fish populations are decreasing in most areas. Now, this results in migration of fishers from place to place. Now, this migration of fishers is not slow. I published a paper in Marine and Freshwater Research in the early 2000s, I think it was 2001, where I was trying to look at the relationship between a number of sociocultural and environmental variables and the health of coral reefs. I used as a measure of the health of coral reefs a mortality index. I broke my sample into two groups on the basis of a dividing line in mortality index that John McManus, one of my co-authors, gave to me. One of the things that I found out, much to my surprise, and I was analyzing this data after I left the Philippines and I was down in Indonesia in Bogor, and I have the data and I look at it, and what do I find? Contrary to my expectations, healthy coral reefs were in areas where there was rapid population growth and greater fisher density. And I thought, I've calculated my mortality index incorrectly. All right? No, I didn't. I went back and checked it. Then I sat and I thought, I'm sitting in a tropical area. What happens if you drop a little bit of sugar on the floor? The ants come. People were migrating to areas with richer coral reefs at such a rate that this would obscure any synchronic analysis of the data. So my results were correct, and I've rechecked them and rechecked them. Of course, it's been published. That areas with the healthy coral reefs were where the population was increasing most rapidly because fishermen were moving there. In addition to that, one of my graduate students, she was a Filipina, she went to the Philippines to an area where fishers were migrating, and she substantiated my interpretation of the data. Okay, so I see a corner of that is cut off. So this results in the migration of fishers, sometimes rapid. Okay, fish populations continue to decrease. This results in reduced incomes and also reduced food security, which is an important variable that some of you talk about. Now, in my coastal sample in the Philippines, and you'll see where my coastal sample is was a little bit later, but in that sample, 38% of the children were underweight. And this is versus 28% throughout the Philippines. That's still a large number. But we have more children underweight in the coastal areas where we have these fishing communities. Then just this morning when I was sitting down in the food court, because I just have so much data, I remember, geez, well, I have information on percentage of fishing families as well. So I ran that correlation. It's something that I hadn't done before just this morning. And what did I find? That the percent of children underweight was significantly correlated with the percent of fishing families in the communities. And the correlation wasn't all that strong, 0.37, but it was significant at the 0.02 level. The sample was relatively small too, around 40. Okay, this decrease in fish populations and decrease in fish being captured results in increased poverty levels. And this leads to the use of more efficient and/or more destructive fishing techniques, things that you've all heard about before, so I don't have to describe them. And this leads to even greater reductions in fish populations. Remember, this is localized too. There are still some areas where the fish populations aren't that bad. I know people like to generalize, but I've been in areas and I've fished in areas in Southeast Asia where the fish populations are still good, and you go to the markets and see it as well. Okay, this results in Daniel Pauly's model of Malthusian overfishing. I've added some more variables to the model because the world is not simple like some people try to make it. It's complex. There are a lot of variables involved. And it's the attempt to simplify the relationships between these variables that results in the lousy projects that we have now with the lousy results that result in still declining fish populations and starvation in some of these coastal communities. I hope that there are some questions about that later. Okay, now what do we have? International demand for fishery products that even results in more pressure on the resource. Local fisheries respond to this international demand, so we get the globalization of markets. Larger industrial fleets start to spread worldwide, so we get globalization of effort. We've got more and more people going after fewer and fewer fish in areas where they weren't fishing before. Some of these areas that I said that I fished where the fishery was good enough for the local people to sustain their livelihoods. And then we end up with the people in these communities even using ever more efficient and more destructive fishing gears. And so competition increases between the fishers. There was already competition, but the competition increases. And so we've got competition between people who are using different gear types. We've got competition of migrants versus locals. We've got competition concerning small-scale versus commercial fisheries. And it's still going on. I was just in Thailand a little over 2 weeks ago, and people, the small-scale fishermen in the communities that I was in were complaining that they'd like to have the commercial fishers fishing even further offshore. I also was involved in setting up a baseline for a post-tsunami project in Thailand on the Andaman Sea coast. And there, they had kept the commercial fishers out of the inshore fishery by putting out artificial reefs, you know, those big concrete tripods. Well, the tsunami messed that up. And while I was there in the northern part of the Andaman coast, very close to the Burmese border, there were commercial fishers once again fishing close to the shore. So we've got conflict in what we called in an article fish wars. Here's the entire model now. It becomes even more complex, and this is simple in comparison to the reality, because each of these points in this model can be composed of numerous other variables that are interrelated with each other. And our failure to take this into account results in the crappy projects that we have at the present time. Okay. What can we do about conflict? How can we avoid conflict? How can we resolve this kind of conflict between fisheries? One way is with top-down fisheries management. The other way is with co-management of fisheries. That is, the government and the local fishers cooperating with each other, communicating with each other concerning the management of the fisheries. The other one is cooperation between the various users, and I'm going to speak about each of these briefly. This then is a model where we have conflict, and I'm showing that we can have top-down management, co-management, or cooperation. I'll talk about top-down management and cooperation first. Well, top-down management results in actions like the trawl ban in the Java Sea. This resulted from the fact, and this is way back decades ago, it resulted from the fact that there was real conflict between small-scale fishermen and the commercial fishermen, or the larger trawlers that were operating in the Java Sea. This resulted in the firebombing of boats. There's destruction of gear even going on today. I just use that as one of the early examples. And it didn't necessarily work, because we have two groups of fishers who are still in conflict with one another. Okay, the next is large boats banned from inshore areas. This was something that was instituted in many Southeast Asian countries, and Thailand is a good example. I just mentioned that. The boats are banned from the inshore areas. They don't necessarily have a coast guard that can keep them away, so they used techniques like putting in the artificial reefs so that the trawlers would get their gear hung up on them. But nevertheless, there was still conflict between smaller scale fishers and larger scale fishers. Cooperation. Everybody likes to talk about conflict. It's like CNN News and the various news magazines and sources that, oh, conflict, that gets people interested. All right, you know, they're going to read about it. They're going to buy our paper if it's conflict. There isn't always conflict. Sometimes small-scale fishers and commercial fishers will cooperate with one another. And one example, just a recent example that I saw in Indonesia. I was working in North Sulawesi, and they have larger scale fishers that operate mini purse seines, and they have small scale fishers, guys with boats with very small motors, sometimes without motors. In the communities where I was working, one of the communities where I was working, there were only 3 of these large scale, mini purse seiners in the community at the time that I worked there. And I was interested in fish aggregating devices at the time because I had a little project concerning fish aggregating devices, and it kept me interested in them, in their role in the fishery. And I found out that the people in this community, even those that didn't operate the large mini purse seines, which was a larger scale fishery in contrast to most of the fishers in that area and in the community, that they would put out fish aggregating devices, which were very inexpensive in comparison to the cost of a mini purse seine and the gear associated with it. I mean, a 50th of the cost for a shallow water fish aggregating device. And at a certain time of the year, those fish aggregating devices would aggregate fish that the mini purse trawlers could go after. And so I'm interested in, well, what's the share of the catch? What do the people get that put out the fish aggregating devices? I was told they got 1/3 of the catch. I couldn't believe it because the economic investment was so slight in comparison. 1/3 of the catch. And so what I always do in a situation like that is I run 100 yards down the beach and ask somebody else before people can get together and get their story to coincide. And everybody said that. They got 1/3 of the catch. Any economist would say, that doesn't make sense. 1/3 of the catch with that economic investment? So I talked to the people about it. Why? They tell me things like, oh, it takes a lot of skill to make sure that the fish are still around, the fish aggregating device. And so we're being reimbursed for that skill. And other people said, well, it's just fair. I'd ask questions like, what would happen if somebody didn't pay, their 1/3 of the catch? Oh, they would just never fish here again. Because they told me whenever the fish are aggregating in this area, it looks like a bus parking lot offshore. There are so many of these mini purse seiners out there waiting for the fish to aggregate to come in. And what it ended up being was that the many purse seiners felt that this was a fair share for the people in that community. The fish was offshore of this community. The people in North Sulawesi, the people who live along the shoreline, who operate the many purse seiners, are for the most part Muslims. And North Sulawesi, in contrast to the rest of Indonesia, is about 95% Christian, but the fishers are mostly Muslims. That this entire coastline was something like one community. Fishers from other communities would pray in the mosques of other communities when they were fishing offshore. So this is what some people have referred to as a moral economy. It was fair. Had nothing to do with how much was invested, like an economist would like to, question an interpretation like I had made. The other thing is that another way is that I have seen that small-scale fishers and larger-scale fishers have worked together, is that the large-scale fishers in some fisheries, like shrimp fisheries, don't want to keep fin fish in their holds because of the value of the fin fish, so they'll often sell it to the small-scale fishermen who come out to the boats. I just want to point out that there are numerous ways that small-scale fishers and large-scale fishers have cooperated with each other, and there isn't necessarily always warfare and conflict between them. Now, the other technique is through co-management, and that this should also reduce the amount of conflict. Well, we had a project several years ago. I know I was in Vietnam in 2004 for this project, and Robert Pomeroy, John Parks, and I have an article that was published in 2007 in Marine Policy where we looked at this data. And we collected data trying to see if there's any relationship between co-management and conflict in fishing communities in Vietnam, Thailand, the Philippines, and Indonesia. There were a total of 18 variables that we used because, like I said, these things aren't simple. And what we had to do was see how much variance was contributed by other variables to conflict in the community. So we selected all of the variables that we could find in the literature concerning variables that influence conflict over resources, as well as having the presence or absence of co-management in the community as one of the variables. And so we had a number of demographic characteristics. We had social stratification as a variable, security issues and civil tension, resource condition and harvest activity, community and resource conflict resolution, marine resource governance and tenurial arrangements, as well as community organization. There were a total of 18 variables throughout these categories. And then just to go rapidly and give you the results, we found that in all of the areas except in Thailand, that co-management had a significant contribution to the level of resource conflict, that is, lowering the level of resource conflict. If co-management were present, the level of resource conflict would be reduced. In Thailand, the influence of co-management was not statistically significant at the 0.05 level, was at the 0.1 levels, but as far as I'm concerned, there was no relationship in Thailand. But in Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, there was. So we feel that the results of this research indicate that co-management can also operate as a conflict resolution device concerning resource conflict. But the question is, if we're going to do co-management, and if we're interested in the relationships between population and our dependent variable, in this case as being resource, a conflict over the resource, how are we going to get an effective co-management scheme? People like to say, all we need is co-management. Well, it isn't that easy. So much of it has failed. Well, I have a little term there called data mining, and I have a project now at the National Center for Ecological Synthesis and Analysis where Patrick Christie and I and a number of colleagues are looking at a lot of data that we have concerning scaling up of marine protected areas. Anyway, I went back to some data that I had on marine protected areas that I collected in 2000 in the Philippines. And for this project, I was focusing on variables that would be associated with scaling up to ecosystem management. Population is one such variable. The larger the resource management area, the larger the associated population in a country like the Philippines. So the research that I'm going to present here that shows a relationship between population and success of a co-management regime in the Philippines. These are all community-based marine protected areas. I think we will illustrate some of the difficulties that we may face in trying to use co-management because of the results that I have. The sample in the Philippines was 45 MPAs, 14 in Bohol, 12 in Leyte, 8 in Cebu, and 11 in Negros Oriental. In this field work, I went to all of these marine protected areas and participated in the assessment. I've got something like 300 variables for each of the marine protected areas. I had a dependent variable of marine protected area performance, and the dependent variable that I'm using here, I had numerous different marine protected area performance variables. This is a composite variable that included biological performance as well as institutional performance and aspects of the MPA. I get the same results, slightly different with respect to just biological performance, if that's all you're interested in. But a marine protected area, the success of a marine protected area has more than biological components because it has the component of empowerment of the community and a number of other things that I can respond to later if you have any questions. Okay, that looks complex, didn't it? I said that the models that I use are complex, and that's because they reflect reality. And if you can't deal with it, like I said before, you're going to end up with the same kinds of projects that you have right now and that you have had in the past. Anyway, the way I developed this model is that I first had MPA performance as my dependent variable. Then I looked at all the other independent variables that had and this is just looking with the population, because I have another model that's more complex than this that I'm not really going to show you, because one of my colleagues said that it just wouldn't be able to be absorbed at a short meeting. But anyway, we look at this, and what I did is I went from marine protected area performance and went back into the correlation matrix, looking at variables that explain more than 15% of the variance. That's a correlation coefficient of approximately 0.40. And look at the largest predictor of marine protected area performance in this model here. It's population. And the correlation between population size, and this is village population size, and marine protected area performance was minus 0.54. That's over 50%, that's over 25% of the variance. 0.54 squared is what? About 30% of the variance is explained by population. Also, once I got population, then I started to look at variables that were correlated with population at a degree that they would explain 15% of the variance or more. Note, I didn't use statistical significance. There's such a thing as practical significance. It has to be statistically significant, but you can have something that's statistically significant that explains 1% of the variance with a sample of about 150. And what's 1% of the variance? Nothing in terms of the variables that we're dealing with. Maybe if it's a cancer rate, it's something, but not with these variables here. So I then looked at population and then looked at variables that were highly correlated with population. Of course, village area was, and also it was interesting, the amount of dependence on fishing was, and it was also, as might be expected, correlated with a variable that I referred to as small island. You're going to ask me, what's a small island? Well, if you're working in the Philippines, they're all islands. A small island is an island off an island. In other words, they're little islands off of Bohol. They're small islands. Okay. And village heterogeneity was another variable in this this model that happened to be related to monitoring by the community, which was also strongly related to marine protected area performance. That is, where the community could get together and monitor the MPA, it would influence MPA performance. But now, this is success of a community-based marine protected area. And the reason that I threw this in was because I was concerned about the fact that some people say, well, we'll just have co-management, and I just wanted to show that the size of population also influences the level of success of a co-management program, because the larger the population that you're dealing with, the more difficult it is to get people to agree and to develop a co-management scheme. So, are we then caught in an endless cycle of negative feedback? We've got large population causing the problem, but because the population is large, it's more difficult to develop techniques to try to reduce the amount of conflict. Not necessarily, because we can try to determine ways to improve cooperation in larger populations to facilitate co-management. And we have done research, and there's research in the literature that tries to indicate how cooperation can be improved in larger populations. The thing is, we can't just go out and say that because we're running training programs and trying to introduce co-management in a community that it's going to work and we're going to solve all the problems. It just doesn't work that way. The other way that we might be able to do it is to combine co-management with appropriate aspects of locally development conflict resolution techniques, like some of the cooperation that I've already demonstrated exists between commercial fishers and small-scale fishers. Of course, you're going to say, oh, the poor resources. You know, the commercial fishers and the small-scale fishers start to cooperate with each other, and it's going to have even a more negative impact on the resources. Well, I'm interested in the resources, but if you want people to cooperate, their children are going to have to be fed. You're not going to step into a community and set up projects that are going to require people to be thinking about the environment and the resources if they don't have enough food, if they don't have enough income. You're going to have to solve that problem with something like appropriate alternative livelihoods, and I will underscore appropriate, and you can ask me about that later as well. The other is population control, and I'm going to say nothing about that. I mean, it's sort of obvious if the populations were lower, but that takes generation at least, or generations to solve. And the resources aren't going to wait for generations. Don't think I'm not interested in the resources. It's just the immediacy of the problem of feeding people and children in these communities where the resources are continuing to degenerate. Right there are photographs from about 3 weeks ago in Thailand in a community where the small-scale fishermen were complaining about the fact that they would like to have the larger-scale fishermen kept further offshore. And right there is a child in Zaragoza in the Philippines looking out into the area of the boat landings, thinking that someday he's going to be a fisherman in this community. Whether or not he's well fed, I don't know at the present time. But that's what this is all about, providing food for people, providing food with the important omega fatty acids that are involved in brain development. If you want people to get involved in resource management, you're going to have people who are going to be able to accept and understand information. And if we have 38% from my sample of the children who are underweight in these communities, and if part of that is because they're not getting the proper animal protein, and we know right now that fatty omega acids are involved in the early development of the brain, then we're going to set up an even more vicious cycle with negative feedback. So how are we going to solve it? Just let people starve to death? I don't know. That's up to you guys. I'm done.
That gives me
An act. An act based on fact. There you go.
Thank you. Just give me 1 minute to pull up my okay, here we go. There. Okay. Well, thank you, Richard, for interesting and impassioned presentation, giving us an overall kind of a picture of what the challenges are. And coming from a development agency, I'm quite pleased to see the emphasis on how we have to deal with these challenges of feeding people and their livelihoods if we want to think about the conservation aspects. What I'm going to do, I was asked to talk a bit about the trade in live reef fish in Southeast Asia as an example of some of the challenges and which arise in resource management and the ways that we can try to overcome some of the very negative impacts both on the resource base and on people and some of the conflicts which arise there. Take a look at some of the policy responses in that particular area that have been tried over the last few years, including co-management and top-down and some of these things, which were mentioned by Richard, and the obstacles they've faced. Why aren't we doing much better? And then finally, I was going to talk about the Coral Triangle Initiative, which is a new initiative that a lot of you have probably heard about of the 6 nations in that area, the so-called Coral Triangle, and a lot of donors, including AID. And we're all scratching our heads, actually, and working with a number of the NGOs and the governments and other donors, trying to figure out how we can do exactly what you were talking about, not design another huge, expensive set of crappy projects that don't work. And it's a challenge. But I thought it would be interesting to share a little information about where that is and some of my own reflections on what are some of the obstacles and pitfalls to making this big new initiative work. Anyway, so this you probably all know, and it's been mentioned, of course, the coral reef ecosystems in Southeast Asia are some of the most important in the world from both a biological perspective and in terms of their incredible importance in supplying animal protein to very poor people in coastal areas. As Richard was mentioning, you have a lot of cash income as well from marine products, both at the local level and the national level. You know, the coral reef ecosystems play an important role, of course, in tuna fisheries and shrimp fisheries, etc. And in general, they're a key element of the wider system involving mangroves and seagrass beds and the whole web of life in the ocean in these areas. And you may have seen these slides, but just to get a sense of the complexity of the biological perspective, this is basically going from areas of the world where you have between 0 and 100 species of hard corals. I believe this is just hard corals. Then you get up to 100 to 200, 200 to 300, 300 to 400, 400 to 500, and above 500. So you see the both the complexity of the ecosystems you're trying to manage. When people talk about ecosystem management as opposed to managing a single fishery or something, these are fantastically complex systems biologically that we don't really completely understand in a lot of ways. And of course, as Richard was saying, they're also very complex systems in terms of the socioeconomic interactions and all the things that human beings bring to the picture. The threats are well known. Overfishing, destructive fishing methods, the developments on coast. You have cities, towns, airports, mines, infrastructure, tourism developments, the pollution that those things create from ports, oil tanks and wells, shipping lanes, plastic and pollution of all kinds, erosion and sedimentation coming completely from outside this the marine area, from increased deforestation and change in land use, runoff of fertilizers, mine tailings, etc. And, of course, climate change and issues of coral bleaching, rise in the level of the sea. This was a map from the pretty well-known report Reefs at Risk in Southeast Asia, though the red areas were those areas when you aggregated all these that were shown to be at a high level of risk. And you see that a lot of places in Sulawesi and the Philippines are facing a lot of threats. This is incidence of coral bleaching, and it's actually rather interesting to see that this is since 1967 until the present, or until last year, that there are areas that have gotten it very, very heavily, and areas particularly in, where's my little poker? Hold on. The kind of eastern Indonesia area here that have not really been that affected. But this is obviously a new concern in terms of the resilience of these areas, both for marine protected areas and for fisheries. Everything is changing. When you look at sea level rise issues, this is the results predicted for a 1 meter rise in sea level. A lot of coastal communities are going to be facing a lot of very, very big changes in these areas. Now, to get on to the trade in reef species, this trade is basically an international trade out of this region. You can divide it into 4 basic parts. The aquarium fish trade, which also trades in corals and live rock, pieces of substrate with things living in it that go into reef aquariums. And the markets for that are mainly in the U.S. and the EU, some in Japan and Taiwan. The trade in live reef food fish, which is basically going into Hong Kong and southern China, which is what I'm mainly going to talk about. The curio trade, what you'll see being sold everywhere all over in terms of shells and dead coral, often for tourist markets. And Chinese medicine, of course, where you get certain specialized kinds of things that go into there, seahorses and sea cucumbers. If you've ever been in a market anywhere in China, or for that matter in Southeast Asia, you've seen a lot of these things, a lot. Now, the aquarium trade is of concern here in the U.S. because basically we are where all these things are going. You can't read this, I know, because you're far back there, but this is from the Global Marine Aquarium Database, where they tried to collect data on the export data from countries over on the left and the import data about where things are coming from on this side. And as you'll see, it's interesting, on the import side, most of it is unknown. So the importing countries don't really know where these fish are coming from. On the export side, they think they know a bit, but there's probably a lot more. But the main point for us here is that the main source countries are in Southeast Asia and a few adjacent islands in the Western Pacific, basically Indonesia and the Philippines. If you look at where they're going, the main point here is, of course, they're going to the U.S. and some to the European Union. This is the same kind of thing. And there's a lot of uncertainty as well. But so this is why this has been of concern in the United States, is that we are the main consumers. The same goes for coral. This is live coral exports, and you can see it's mostly coming out of Indonesia and Fiji. It's been banned for some time in the Philippines. And it's basically going to the United States. Here's the total. Here's the United States. The rest are not going into the EU. This is from showing the increases, too, from 1988 up until 2004. So the live food fish trade is quite different. These fish are basically going to markets in Hong Kong and southern China, and they don't have to live that long. They've only got to get into the market into the right size to fit on a plate, and then they get dropped into a pot and cooked. They're coming mainly from Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific areas. Overfishing is very common. Destructive methods like cyanide is used in some cases to stun the fish. It's a high value type of fishery, though. These fish go for very high prices. And the volume compared to other fisheries is relatively low. So in theory, it's kind of a good thing. It's possible. But the operators are very mobile. They do a kind of a boom and bust, move around kind of a thing. You go into an area, exploit the fish as much as possible, and move on. And they're mobile in the sense that people who are involved in this fishery are often just traders. They aren't fishermen. They're people who use their ships. I've seen ships refitted for carrying electronics. It's like the price of fish is low, we'll do electronics for a while. It's just another commodity to them. They could be doing textiles or electronics or anything. It's just fish is another thing to buy and sell. And it's very sensitive to economic factors, as you'll see in a second. When the financial crisis came in the late 1990s, things dropped quite a bit, but incomes are growing in China. This is basically a cultural preference in southern China in basically for these sort of high-value fish for special occasions, which you pick live and then you serve at like a graduation or the closing of a business deal or something like that. So as incomes rise in China, there's more and more of a demand. But also energy prices are going up, as we all know, and so the transport prices to get the fish, which are brought by air and sea, is affected. And you have the substitution of wild-caught fish by those which are raised by aquaculture in some cases. So this trade expanded. Basically, in the 70s, people fished around Hong Kong and then went into the Philippines. By the 1980s, they were looking a bit further wide into areas in Indonesia. By the 90s, when prices were really, really high and there was just a boom in this, you began to see these operations appearing in very remote places, in like Untung Jawa in the north of the Solomon Islands, and Kiribati in the Marshall Islands, all through this area here. That's contracted a bit since then. Most of these operations have gone belly up because the transport costs are very, very high, of course. Flying is out of the question here. There's also more fish coming out of Australia, so I'll point out in a moment. So this is where things stand more or less today. The Western Pacific trade is really not happening too much, and you've got a lot of leopard coral trout, Plectropomus leopardus in particular, coming off the Great Barrier Reef, and they go by air. That's been going on for a while. You've got sea routes coming out of the Philippines, some air routes coming out of there, and out of Indonesia. And then here's some more detail on some parts of the Philippines and Indonesia. But that's basically what's happening, is you've got a flow of these high-value fish flowing into the markets there. And this is basically where they start. That's a Plectropomus leopardus, I'm pretty sure, a leopard coral trout. He starts out swimming on the reef. You have various boats which get filled up. They're captured either with a hook and line sometimes, or with traps, or with cyanide, which can stun them. They go into a crevice, and then you bash at it with a crowbar in the coral, and you get the fish out and revive it. They can be carried in these air tanks. Those are that's the Australian versions. It's basically an aerated, reusable shipping tank, or they go in boxes. They go in small planes. They go in many different ways. There's some being put in bags, and they get put into just boxes like this sometimes. Sometimes they're held in these areas to grow them to plate size, 1/2 kilo to 1 kilo. That's about the size. So often when there's not a lot of mature fish left, they'll catch the juveniles, and they'll throw them in here, catch other smaller, cheaper fish to feed them, because these are all carnivores, basically. And then they ship them out. What did I do? There, okay. They end up in Hong Kong, and we are in Hong Kong, where you also have a number of these holding tanks where they may be grown out some more or held here. They always have very vicious dogs. I've spent a lot of time on these cages, and they sometimes cut the legs off the dog. One leg will be chopped off of a dog because a 3-legged dog can't swim. Therefore, it will stay. It can still bark and bite and run around on the cages, but it can't swim, so it's pretty frequent. I think he's got all 4 legs. No, he may be the 3-legged dog, actually, but that's just an interesting little fact. There are many, many of these cages around Hong Kong. Here's an aerial view. You can see a ship there. There are hundreds and hundreds of these where they're held. They get into the main markets here. Here's the markets where they're coming in. More of our friend there, the leopard coral trout, all getting ready to go into these tanks which are next to these restaurants. And here's another one there. And they join many, many other marine species. You get strange kinds of clams and all sorts of lobster-type things, crustaceans, and it's quite a wide variety. People come through, they pick what they want, and there is where he ends up, in a restaurant, or in the more idealized version on the poster out front, something like this. Now, you get fish like the Napoleon Wrasse, is probably the highest value fish. Here's a fully mature one in a tank in Guangzhou, I think this was. The thing that's interesting is that these big guys are pretty hard to find, and so what you get is a lot of juveniles. So these are Calinus undulatus, the Napoleon Wrasse, or humphead wrasse, who are juveniles, haven't reproduced yet, who have been taken off the reef You see many, many of these, and these are sort of ideal plate size as well. There's not as much market for the big banquet size ones that you have there. This guy here is Promoleptus altiveolus, so they call it a mouse grouper. He's also very high value, and our friend there, Reflector pomus. This is an interesting one, the Queensland Grouper. These grow to be very, very big. Epinephelus lanceolatus, I think it's called. One of these sold in, I think, 1998, a big one like this, for $11,000 in Hong Kong live. Then they began to breed them in Taiwan, I believe. They figured out how to culture them, and now they're quite common. I've got hundreds of pictures of tanks and tanks of them, and the price has gone down. And so that's hopefully had a positive effect on the wild stocks, because they were quite endangered for a while. Chinese footballer, all sorts of, and you get some strange things. That's a moray eel. You get a lot of things that aren't there. These markets are pretty amazing to see. Now the import picture, you can see back here in 1998 it was very, very high. The high value ones are at the bottom here. You had a drop. It's gone up. It's been going up again, and you're talking about imports of about 16 to 20,000 tons. We're not sure exactly where it is, but if it's continued an upward trend, it could be getting back up towards where it was. The total imports into Hong Kong have risen by about 27.5% since 2002, maybe a little bit more by now. A lot of it is not declared. If you're basically a Chinese boat, if you're flagged as a Chinese boat, you can come into Hong Kong and not declare your catch. And so they think it's the fishing people think it's about 15%, and it could be more. About half, almost 40% to 50% of what's imported there is transshipped into southern China, into the cities there, Shenzhen and Guangzhou and other places. The total retail value, it's really hard to tell. It's, maybe $400 million a year, $500 million a year. It could be a lot more. Depends on what species you count, how much do you count the crustaceans and all that. The trend is towards the higher value stuff. As often happens in an economic downturn, the rich get richer, and they can afford the really high-end stuff and the stuff in the bottom. So the species at the bottom of the price range have dropped quite a bit, but there's been still a lot of pressure on some of these high-value ones that we saw the pictures of. So what are some of the impacts which we're worried about? Well, obviously overfishing of these target species, but again, and also overfishing of other fish to feed them in these grow-out cages. These fish eat a lot of fish themselves when they're growing out. Often, some of these fish, they spawn in aggregations, and those are targeted and can just be completely wiped out, as has been recorded in another place. And the small fish who haven't reproduced yet. In some cases, some species, some places, you have the problem of cyanide fishing, which has obviously a lot of problems with high mortality, bycatch, and effects on the coral, and it's one of the reasons I think there's been so much interest in this fishery. It's like people are interested in car crashes or something. It's how I got interested in this. In the mid-1990s, it was like, you mean they catch fish with cyanide and they take them alive and then they boil them alive in front of their eyes? That's just, it's not like just buying fish in the market or something like that, because there was a lot of interest and attention and, about this whole industry. You have diving injuries for poorly trained divers. I met divers in Vietnam who said they stayed down on a tube for 5 hours at 150 feet, things like that. If you're a diver, that's not good. So you get a lot of injuries from all sorts of injuries, but obviously from people getting the bends. The depletion of locally important food species. Of course, you get a lot of conflict. These outsiders come in, and some of these species, both the target species and the ones that are caught to feed them, are things which people depend on. The prices paid to local fishers is often pretty low, incredibly low. Like a Napoleon Wrasse, so these things were going for, I don't know, $200 a kilo at one point. In the Solomon Islands, in Hong Kong, Solomon Islands, they were paying people about 50 cents for a whole fish. These are big fish. So there is not a lot of benefit which is going to local fishers in a lot of cases. And there are, of course, conflicts that arise from the growing scarcity, disputes over the rights to who can fish where when outsiders come in, the distribution of the profits in the community, who's involved and who's not, all the kinds of things which happen when you introduce a new economy into an existing social and economic system. So the root causes of the problems, I think Richard has fairly well covered, and they apply to most fisheries. This is kind of a boutique fishery or something like this, but it's subject to them. The question of this, you have this whole sort of open access situation in certainly in many parts of Southeast Asia, where the state claims to control and manage the seas, but it doesn't. They have no capacity, no systems, so it's really just open access. It's whoever's most powerful or can exert their own control. And they stubbornly keep on saying, we are in charge, but of course they're not when you go out in the real world. You have weak enabling kinds of policies and conditions for community-based management. Everyone talks about it, but you look at what governments are doing to support that, and you don't get, it's often not up to the talk that you get at the policy level. These operators, as I mentioned, are very mobile. Their accountability is not downward, or upward for that matter, and they have very little kind of a commitment to sustaining this resource. It's not the sort of thing that they necessarily need to be in business in 5 years. They might be in oil palm or real estate or any number of things. You get a lot of the communities that you might want to work with for community-based management. To an outsider, they look like a community. It's a bunch of people living in the same place. But they're not a community. It's a bunch of people who have been attracted to a transient economic opportunity and happen to be living in the same place at the same time. They come from different places. They have no collective capacity for action, no community institutions. Or they could be places that had that kind of a structure for collective action in the past, but they don't anymore because of new economic incentives and pressures, new migrants coming in, and that sort of thing. So it becomes very hard to figure out what you do at the community level. And there's not much pressure on the demand side or action in terms of policy or in terms of the consumer. Doesn't really care that much about, the source and of the fish or how it's collected or anything like that. In fact, there's been some talk that in some parts of China that the fact that a fish was endangered, when it would be in the paper that the Lanceolatus was an endangered species, the price would go up because, oh, good, I want to eat an endangered species kind of thing. That's like very high status. So there's a whole different kind of sort of a worldview on this. And the interest of the donors and NGOs and others who could do something about this has been sporadic and variable. There's a lot of interest in the live fish trade in the mid-'90s and for a while, and then it still goes on, it still continues, but has sort of dropped away at this point, maybe out of frustration at not being able to do anything. And the types of conflict I think Richard mentioned. You have intra-community conflicts over property rights, resource depletion, the distribution of profits, which can be issue between old and young people, men and women. As you change the fishery and things, it will change those things and can lead to stresses and tensions. The local fishers versus the outside operators, the local fishers versus the state, who are often in league with the outside operators. You have things at the regional level with source countries and the consuming countries in terms of illegal fishing incursions. In the Philippines, this happens quite a bit, where you have a boat, it was just a case last year, I guess, a big boat got captured filled with illegal fish on Tubataha Reef, which is a World Heritage Site and everything. And, they basically, for diplomatic reasons, they let them all go, I believe, is what happened in the end. But it was quite a tense situation. Cases of ciguatera poisoning, which get into these fish in some places, more from the Pacific Islands, and that creates stresses often. A bunch of people get sick or die in Hong Kong, and people are blamed. Trade-related kinds of environmental things, in terms of if someone talks about putting a restriction or banning the trade, then it gets into some of the trade-related issues. And the whole sort of controversy we're all familiar with between conservation pressures and that whole side. This is great biodiversity. It's the global center of marine biodiversity, and we need to conserve it, and we need to take strong measures versus people that need to eat, as Richard was saying. So those are different types of tensions and stresses. They don't always break out in conflict. And as Richard said, there are examples where people do cooperate and work things out. But in the case of this particular fishery, because of its unique characteristics, it seems to lead to a lot of conflict and rapid depletion. So what have people tried to do to solve these problems? You've had top-down, as Richard was saying, kinds of attempts at government regulation and enforcement. You've had mechanisms based on the market with certification, trying to find ways you can use market pressures to bring sustainability to the trade in aquarium fish, and a little bit in the trade in live food fish in corals, aquaculture of target species as a way to replace. If we could just grow it, we wouldn't have to get it from the wild. Sounds good in theory. And, of course, approaches to community-based management. All of these have faced obstacles. I'll just run through those really quickly. With government regulation and enforcement, sometimes it's the foxes guarding the henhouse. You have ongoing power relationships and corruption that make it very difficult. The people who are causing the problems often are people who are elements of the government. You often have a long legacy of mistrust between the central government and people in local communities. So it's difficult to begin to build up any kind of a co-management relationship to do more things more sustainably. The legal frameworks and the provisions themselves are sometimes inadequate. In the Philippines and Indonesia, you have problems with decentralization, where the government overall is changing. And in the Philippines, it's more long-standing. They're trying to move more authority to the local level, but it's sometimes been incomplete or has problems or there's conflicts about the jurisdiction and who controls resources, and that leads to a lot of problems when you try to come up with a regulatory regime or do enforcement. That's not limited to the fisheries sector. You see that in forestry as well. The government doesn't often have the capacity to do enforcement, even if it's trying to do the right thing. They don't have the financing or the boats or the staff. There's often a dependence in resource sectors. In the Philippines, this has been very pronounced on external financing from donors. When the donor money runs out, activities just stop because they have grown to depend on that. We can spend our money on other things people really want, like roads and churches and schools and health clinics and things like that, because the donors will pay for all this marine management and conservation stuff. And then you have this problem of the lack of appropriate alternative sources of income, that people just rebel. People say, you shouldn't be overfishing here, and it's, what the hell else am I supposed to do? I have to feed my kids. They're all underweight. So those are some of the problems that you face on that side. The market-based approach is probably the best known as Marine Aquarium Council, and I'll confess I was on the board of the Marine Aquarium Council for a few years and involved when it was getting started. I worked at World Resources Institute. It's not done very well, basically because the supply chains are so complex. There's so many species. 1,000 species of aquarium fish are exported from the Philippines, for instance. I mean, most of them are from about 20 species, but it's very difficult. The supply chains, many small people are out there doing the collection. It's very hard to do that. Sustainability is very hard to monitor. We don't know much about a lot of these ecosystems. How can you tell if you're taking too many or too less? What's it doing to the species or the ecosystem? There are practical problems and scientific problems, and the lack of scientific knowledge. There's no market premium. People that buy aquarium fish don't really care, it would seem, if they come from a sustainable source or not. It's been very hard to see that you could sell those fish for more because they were being handled in a certain way and certified. And there hasn't been much pressure for policy reform on the demand side from, say, the U.S. government. It's not really, it's basically, hey, if you want to import fish here, just make sure that, you have a piece of paper. So where they come from, are they legal, are they caught in an illegal method like cyanide or not? There hasn't really been an effective way to do that. On the live reef food fish trade side, there is an effort to develop some industry standards and get industry behind this, and kind of modeled on the MAC model. How far it's going to go, I'm not sure. The standards themselves have been developed over the last 4 or 5 years. They're pretty good, but there's a total lack of market pressure on that side. People just don't care. And there's, as of yet, no institutional structure for how you would bring together industry and the traders and the other aspects of the supply chain. And I think in both cases, markets alone, there's no such thing as a free market ever in the world. I mean, all markets exist in some sort of a regulatory framework. That's why I can't open a toxic waste dump in my front yard in Georgetown. It's even though I could probably get people to dump stuff there. It's the same thing. And you really need to think of this, as something that's going to be a combination of market pressures and the policy incentives around it. So I think any approach that just tries to deal with manipulating market pressure is not going to work. Aquaculture, it's difficult to culture some preferred species. The market in Hong Kong and southern China has a preference for wild caught. Like we like wild salmon versus the cultured stuff. Go in the store. It's more expensive. Some people will say, The taste is the same, but there's still a certain sense of that. Often the people who benefit from aquaculture are not the same people who are benefiting from catching those same species in the wild. It takes capital, technology, and other things. So the people who are out there fishing for their lives aren't the ones who are going to benefit often from the aquaculture, and sometimes the opposite, because you produce a lot more of a high-value fish, the prices drop, then the people doing wild caught have to catch more in order to get the same amount of income. A lot of what they call aquaculture is really wild caught, and then they throw them in these cages and feed them more fish. So that's another problem. And this puts a lot of pressures for people to collect fish. In Vietnam once, I spent some time with people who do the grow out of lobsters. They capture them. There were 9,000 lobster cages at that time along the coast north of Nha Trang. And some people we were working with had done some filming and showed them to the local government. And the reefs are in pretty good condition, and there's not one fish on that reef anywhere, because everyone is catching every fish they can possibly get. Doesn't matter what it is, lobsters will eat anything to feed to the lobsters that are selling at the cage for 25 bucks a piece, about a kilo, and selling in Hong Kong for like $70 a piece, you know? So people are getting rich and they like it, but they wiped out the fish in that whole area. And then you have problems when you have any intensive area of aquaculture with spread of diseases and the pollution. So the community-based management, I think Richard has covered this pretty well. Some of the problems that have been faced are a lack of property rights in many places, the demographic pressures, which Richard mentioned, the fact that some of the communities you're trying to work with aren't really very cohesive, like I mentioned before. That in those that have had traditional institutions, they're being eroded. You have all these new external actors and technologies, increasing local demand for cash income. You have, as I mentioned, a lack of policies to really enable stronger community-based rights and management, lack of access to credit and to technology, and lack of market access, basic things, ice, roads, all those kinds of things. So, you know, there are a lot of problems out there, and I'll just say something briefly about this Coral Triangle Initiative. I know some of you are very involved in this, and but for those who aren't, can we do something better as donors and people who care about this from the side of development NGOs, conservation NGOs, and folks like AID? It's a political initiative from the 6 nations in that area: Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, Timor-Leste, Papua New Guinea, and Solomon Islands. The big NGOs have really been a driving force in this and done really great work to get this going and get a political commitment at the highest level. And this really got started in September when it was announced at the APEC summit in Australia. It was kind of this whole effort came out. A lot of donors are supporting this. The GEF is giving $60 million, was just announced last month, and that's matched by about $300 million or so from the World Bank, UNDP, Asian Development Bank, and various others. AID is coming in over the next 5 years probably with about $30 million in support for activities under the umbrella of the Coral Triangle Initiative. A lot of the private foundations, like the Walton Foundation, put a lot of funding into this. I think they put like $14 million into some of the work in Indonesia. They're working on this strategic framework that I'll say a little bit about that was decided and announced at the first senior officials meeting in December and is currently in a frenetic phase of strategic planning and design. In fact, there's a big meeting next week in Jakarta that a number of our colleagues are at to move towards a second senior officials meeting in June, which will basically try to put in place this whole plan. So that's the area they're talking about there. Which is interesting if you look at it. If you look at the Coral Triangle biological map, you see that it's basically that area in here, but they've chopped off western Indonesia. It's interesting, I guess because they just thought that it was just too difficult there. But that's sort of the area of the focus. So there are basically 5 desired outcomes which have been agreed by all of the governments. I'll just run through these really briefly. Sort of a seascape level design, some large scale areas which one can really take a hold of and and they want to designate some specific areas by a specific date to be effectively managed there. Looking at the fisheries aspect, an ecosystem approach, the management of fisheries, and this is rather interesting in that they've chosen to focus of all the fisheries, not so much on the near shore like the dead reef trade, I guess I would call it, but on the live fish trade to create a regional forum, on the live reef food fish trade, and on tuna, the two areas, which is has a lot of political appeal, I think. I'm not sure how I think we need to work some of the more mainstream fisheries, the workaday fisheries of all the millions of people who live there and depend on them for their subsistence a bit more. Marine protected areas, of course, get more of them and better managed and have some target dates for the areas. Adapting to climate change, this is kind of an empty sell at this point, I think. Everyone knows there's a lot of work to be done in adaptation, both of marine resources and of coastal communities who deal with climate change-induced weather disasters and, and things like that, but this still has to be developed. And a species focus as well. So that's kind of the 5 outcomes, the kind of approaches that the government's agreed to. Basically an assessment, monitoring, information function, sustainable financing function, capacity building, public-private partnership approach, working with private sector and NGOs, and coming up with the correct enabling laws and policies. Interesting that the community-based management didn't make this list. Although it does appear under the, when they talk about marine protected areas. The governance structure is still a work in progress, kind of standard, a governing council of ministers, a secretariat, some kind of a broader forum of partners, some support things, a bunch of donors to provide the finance, and some national focal points. That's still very much a work in progress and exactly who will do what. And finally, just some food for thought about this. A lot of governments are saying our commitment is manifest because our head of state said that they support the Coral Triangle Initiative and will participate in it. And I don't see that as real national commitment. Of course they're supporting it. It's $500 million. I mean, I would support it too, there's a chance, and so the hard policy decisions about reducing fisheries subsidies, figuring out what to do about marine property rights, corruption enforcement, enabling conditions for community-based management. Those hard decisions have not yet been identified, and they really need to be a part of this if we're not going to have, as Richard was saying, the same dumb old projects. If governments aren't behind it. And their financial commitments, just as Indonesia is leading this whole thing, it's reduced its budget for its, the Ministry of Marine Affairs and Fisheries dropped dramatically over the last couple of years. So I'm not sure what kind of a commitment that shows, except maybe that's, oh good, we can get all this money from the donors so we can shift it over, into another ministry. But that's not a good sign for sustainability. The big NGOs have been really key partners, and and I don't want to take anything away from all of their good work. They've really been driving a lot of this. But 2 areas where I think that they may need to bring some other partners. And when you talk about things like tuna fisheries, you're talking about big economic interests and a whole other set of actors. And I'm not sure that they quite are in the place where they can be really effective in transforming something like that. It's a whole other set of actors and some really nasty characters. It's a big fishery. And in terms of critical policy advocacy, who's going to be beating the governments about the head to try and get this done? It can't be the ones who are really partners and sitting with them at the table. You need to have something from the other side as well. The Coral Triangle countries are in real different situations, the Philippines versus the Solomon Islands, in terms of their capacity, their cultures, a whole bunch of things. And, it can't be a one-size-fits-all kind of an approach. Again, the big conservation NGOs are really key to this whole thing. It wouldn't have happened without them. But I've already begun to hear from some people, there's kind of a feeling that this is a very exclusive top-down kind of process, and it risks excluding, charges of excluding national NGOs, a monopolization of the donor funding, and an overly conservationist kind of an agenda. That, these are organizations known mainly for conservation and not for dealing with poverty and livelihood and development. And So it'll be important as this moves along to begin to bring in some more of those kinds of actors if we want to get buy-in from the people that really have to change their behavior and are going to, as Richard was saying, you're not going to make any progress with this if people don't have food to feed their kids. And that's the other point here I was making, that there's, the emphasis on sustainable livelihoods and economic opportunities for very poor people seems as so far not willfully underemphasized, but is not very well developed in how we're thinking about this. The climate change focus on adaptation is very narrow. It's looking at how do you adapt in coral reefs, basically, in terms of how you design marine protected areas and things. But that's not how communities look at this. They're looking at things like their whole coastal human ecosystem as well, and what adaptation things do they have to do. And coral reefs are a big part of that. But they're thinking about their infrastructure, their agriculture, a whole range of things. And again, to get interest and concern, you're going to have to get it a little bit wider, although that's still a very undeveloped area. And community-based management, I need things much stronger emphasis, and not just in the marine protected areas context, but in the whole context of the overall fisheries issues and the whole way that one thinks about managing the marine environment and its interactions. So I'll just leave it at that, and thanks a lot. Where's my thank you slide? Thank you. Hope that wasn't too long.
Thank you both. You've obviously given us an awful lot to think about and process and respond to. So why don't we go straight to questions, and for the interest of time and getting lots of voices in, why don't we capture a couple questions and group them, and then Chip and Richard can divide and conquer in terms of responding to them. Who would like to start us off? There were plenty of provocative statements there, so I am certain that there will be some questions and thoughts and responses. Yeah? Okay. Gentleman right here, please.
Thank you for those wonderful presentations. Those were very informative. I appreciate both perspectives on not only the socioeconomic side, but the biodiversity side, as I'm a former marine biologist myself. And I wanted to pose a question to both of you. With development of aquaculture exponentially increasing both technology and capacity around the world, how do you see the role of artisanal aquaculture projects helping alleviate some of these problems with food security in that region of the world, specifically a Coral Triangle initiative?
Terrific. And sir, if you could tell us who you are?
I'm sorry, I'm Justin Grubich from the Office of Marine Conservation at the U.S. State Department, and I will put a plug in that the U.S. State Department is also supporting the Coral Triangle initiative.
Good. Okay. Do we have another couple that we can put in together with that? Yes, right here, Sonia, right here in the front.
Yes, I'm Michael Arbuckle from the World Bank. I was interested in the discussion on co-management. I've had some experience running a co-management organisation, and one of the things that strikes me about the use of the term is it's used very loosely. And some of the work done by ICLAM and World Fish and others has identified the fact that some of these co-management approaches, and they've used the term instrumental type approaches, have been failures in their own right, where really it's just government and guys allocating out some activities. And it seems to me that there's some definition needed around that term when you're using it. I wonder if you could comment on that. And also link that perhaps to what the heck ecosystem-based management means in terms of this Coral Triangle.
Why don't we take those two, because there are actually 3 or 4 between the two of them.
When I talked about providing alternative livelihoods for fishers, I said I underscored acceptable or appropriate alternative livelihoods. And a lot of my work with fishers has involved their love of their occupation. If you live in these communities and you work with them, either in developed countries like the United States and in developing countries, they get something out of fishing besides its being just an occupation. Now, just to look at the aquaculture question, I'll just talk about one where I had a fair amount of experience in an area where seaweed culture was, and that's a form of aquaculture, was growing because of a number of factors, one being the Asian financial crisis, which resulted in inflation of the value of the rupiah declining in Indonesia. So they could, the actual price in some of the rural communities that they were getting for the seaweed culture product was relatively high. This is because of the international, difference in terms of the rate of exchange. And so aquaculture in North Sulawesi started to become, aquaculture of seaweed started to grow. In an area where I was working, I don't have the percentages in my head, this is all down. There's an article that I published with several other people that includes not only Indonesia but the Philippines. It was in ocean coastal management. And I saw aquaculture go from providing, a very small percentage of income to a very small percentage of coastal households in the communities where I was working, all the way up to about 90% of the households in a matter of 2 years between 1997 and 2000. And it also went from something like providing, whenever they'd rank it in terms of income for the household, going from, a very high, a low rank, in other words, they'd rank it as 6th or 7th in terms of providing income. It went all the way to 1st on average. I went back 2 years later and it was gone. But when I was there, when aquaculture was going on, who did it? Coastal aquaculture can be practiced by the women and the children. The fishermen continued to fish. People always say, we give them something else to do. They don't want to fish. That's a dirty, hard occupation. Well, that is not true. They like to fish. But it's also adaptive. Because if you think of any organism, you have this adaptive polymorphism in an organism. Well, cultures are the same way. And these coastal communities maintain a large number of different activities. Why? Because some of the activities can end up being non-productive in a very short period of time. When I went back in 2002 for a post-evaluation on the project, I found that the fishermen had continued to fish. The role of seaweed culture in the community went down to nil because the seaweed culture ended up disappearing because of ice disease, and as was indicated by Chip, as you start to aquaculture species, the concentration of them often results in diseases. So these coastal people aren't stupid. In other words, they respond to global markets. They may start to use different techniques as alternative for sources of alternative income, but they continue the old ones. These people were fishers and they continued to fish. Other people could do the aquaculture. And it was adaptive. It would have been awful if everybody went into aquaculture and people sold their boats and quit fishing. They would have starved to death. So that's my comment on aquaculture. I've seen it fail more than it succeeded in terms of being an alternative livelihood for coastal peoples. It's what got me interested in project post-evaluation, and when I went around, and this is an article that I published so long ago, I can't remember where, when I went around to different development agencies and asking them, did you collect, did you post-evaluate your projects to see what was happening? And I found out that their post-evaluation was just pure, utter garbage. And I visited some of these aquaculture sites and found mosquito ponds. The same thing Chip said is when the outside donor money stops coming in, the project disappears. So go ahead, aquaculture projects. Show me.
Richard, did you want to answer the question about defining co-management?
Oh, co-management has been so variously defined. And I remember a long time ago, I said that, you're talking about co-management. What does that mean? It can go anywhere from, there's so many ways you can define it, that it's on a continuum. The difference the difference of influence of the government and the local people and where they have their influence. Co-management itself is a variable, and it's a multi-dimensional variable. And until people start to learn that human behavior is extremely complex, and it isn't just simple co-management versus not co-management, or what? Community-based management versus not community-based management. Until they start to learn that, once again, I'm going to say they're going to continue to have failures in terms of their projects. Until they start to include all these variables in analysis, in comparative analysis of projects across a number of sites, they're going to continue to fail. Because that is what has to be done. And the amount of money that it would take to do adequate comparative analysis of things like this across a large number of sites is so small in comparison to that, what was it, $500 million?
I'll probably get up there.
My examination of 45 marine protected areas in the Philippines was financed by Packard for $50,000, and we had money left after it was over. 45 sites that we visited. I mean, we rode on tricycles and slept on floors. We didn't go around in air-conditioned vehicles like a lot of you people here do. Go down to a village in an air-conditioned vehicle and assess a project. What a bunch of garbage. Excuse me. Is that enough?
Yeah, well, I used to actually just ride, when I was in the Philippines doing this sort of work, I beat up bicycle myself, you know, over the mountains and everything like that. No, I would just say on the artisanal aquaculture, yeah, I've seen examples where it works, but you have to take there are a lot of factors you have to take into account, and you don't want to come in and sell something to a community that, you know, may not work, or it may work for a little while and then not work. You know, it has to be something that they want to do, and that they have access to the technology and the markets. And I mean, I've seen some pretty good projects, people doing culturing live rock in Fiji to sell to the aquarium trade that the women can do out there, you know, and it doesn't really interrupt what they're doing. It adds an additional source of income. And, you know, it's introducing a very simple technology, basically, and they were able to do it. Or, you know, this lobster fishery in Vietnam is pretty incredible. It's got a lot of problems, but these people went from being dirt poor to being pretty wealthy without any donor, anything. They just were responding to an economic opportunity, very simple kind of a technology. They put a piece of bamboo to attract the small fry, and they had kind of a little thing, and then they go and they pick them up, they put them in cages, and they feed them fish, and then they sell them to people who come and buy them for lots of money.
How long is it going to last if they fished all the feed fish out of the coral reefs?
Well, that's the problem. You know, that's the problem. So can you find ways to do that in ways that are going to be sustainable and deal with the disease questions and are not going to have all these, you know, other impacts? But yeah, I mean, I think that it's, you know, it's one of a number of options. On the co-management, I just mentioned when I first moved to the Philippines, I worked with a group called the Temboyag Development Center, which was basically a bunch of, they were Marxists who had been fighting the Marcos regime, and then they became environmentalists, and it was a very interesting group, and they were involved in marine conservation and management, and they spent so much time fighting against the concept of co-management. They said, no, it's community-based management that we're talking about, community-based coastal resources management. Co-management is just a sham where the government's going to sort of come in and say they're doing community-based management, but they'll still be in charge, and they're not going to really give things up. And this went back and forth forever and ever and ever. The thing is that there can be some truth in that. I mean, it's like either you trust your government or you don't. I mean, you know, and if you don't trust your government and you can't work with the people in the government, it doesn't matter what you call it. It's always going to be a sham. I mean, it's building up those relationships of trust and actually building those enabling kinds of conditions which allow people from government agencies and local communities to work together, which is really important. You know, because I think that, I mean, I've seen some great community-based management things. I went to Condabo Island in Fiji back in 2001, where they'd have wonderful community-based local marine reserve. It's been declared by the community, all, you know, the traditional resource rights and everything on the Astrolabe Reef. Beautiful corals, nice little fish, not one predator on that whole reef. You won't see a shark, you won't see a grouper, and at nighttime you sit there, you know, at the end of the day you come back, you're sitting around with them all, sitting around and drinking kava, and what do you see out along the shore but just lights as far as you can see? There is just huge numbers of trawlers and longliners and everything out there. And community-based management can't do anything about that. A lot of them are illegal. You need the state to do something about that. I mean, all the good management in the world is not going to bring back those fish. So there is definitely a role for both sides of it if you want to really restore these systems. But like I said, it's if the government's rotten, the government's rotten. It doesn't matter what you call it. And if the government's good and really working with the community in a mutually beneficial way, then in some sense it doesn't matter what you call it either, as long as it works. I don't care what you call it. Oh, and on the ecosystem-based management of fisheries question, sorry, I actually wrote that comment in one of the drafts, endless drafts of documents on the Coral Triangle Initiative. I said, I've read all 20 pages of this, and I have no idea what this means. I mean, and that makes me worry about whether heads of state and ministers and people know what it means. I mean, I can give you what I think would be a definition. It would be something different from managing for a single species for maximum sustainable yield. You'd be looking at the role of a number of species in the ecosystem, trying to maintain its overall balance and having a, that aspect, as opposed to we're focusing on these 3 target species. How many can we pull out of the ocean this year and still have that many to pull out of the ocean next year? Which would be the sort of more traditional approach. So I assume that is the direction that we're trying to go into. The reality is we're just talking about management. Most of these fisheries are unmanaged. There are no limits. There are no rules. They're just open access stuff. So it's a polite way of saying let's put some kind of fisheries management in place that's going to be sustainable.
Up here in front, the mic's there. Be there, and then come back here. Sonia, get a workout here.
Maria Hatziolos from the World Bank. Since the CTI consists of the very highest level, supposedly, of political leadership, I mean, the president of Indonesia was the one who invited the rest of his regional countries to join him. Whether or not he may be committed personally to this or this is a political maneuver, it seems that there is an opportunity here to use that public commitment to extract, if you will, the kinds of policy reforms that we need. And those should be some of the indicators in the GEF project, the CTI. I mean, the GEF is now being extremely exigent about, performance indicators, and policy reform is one of the top things that they're looking for. So why not include some of these reforms as performance indicators? I mean, you're not going to get all of them, but you could have a list of at least some, and then just keep the pressure on these guys, throughout the process.
I can give a really quick response to that.
Why don't we capture one?
Sure.
I'm Helen Rafael, Resources for the Future, and I'm an economist who's taught for a number of years economics and environmental science in both Indonesia and China. In fact, most recently, 2 years at Sichuan University in Chengdu, where I have a lot of friends now. I wonder whether I was a little upset by seeing your final picture of the little child looking out over the ocean, and your remark was that in a few years he would be fishing. And it seems to me that perhaps it's more important for the NGOs and so forth to educate the children, improve health also, so that the families wouldn't have to have so many children, and educate them and have economic development in other areas so that the youngsters can grow up performing more different, not necessarily fishing, more economically important roles in a developing economy. So I wonder whether your focus entirely on fishing is appropriate, or whether the NGOs, some of them perhaps are right in not putting so much money into the fishing area, but into economic development, education, and health in general.
Okay, I think we'll take those two. I will, well, no, why don't we get a couple more? But I will, as you're getting the microphones, do an advertisement. Richard mentioned that Leona Diagnos is going to speak tomorrow. In fact, presenting this new focus brief that's called Fishing for Families, Reproductive Health and Integrated Coastal Management in the Philippines, which gets at some of these questions of obviously very challenging in terms of alternative livelihoods, but an integrated development package. And so I urge you all to come back and join in that discussion, sharing those insights. But why don't we had two questions there. Go ahead.
Dan Skler from the Jeff I.W. Learn Project. Very conscious of the fact that a number of countries, particularly in Africa, are exporting protein, are net exporters of protein even as their populations are net deficient. One might call that the omega-3 syndrome based on our speaker today. I'm also conscious of the fact that a lot of what we're talking about here is focused strictly on the extraction side of the marine resource and the coral reef resources. And I think just a few hundred yards from here is the Potomac River, where we just had a very successful decade or two of restocking shad after a generation of them disappearing, this anadromous fish. And I'm wondering whether in any of the activities we're looking at the possibility of engaging fishermen in livelihoods that are based on restocking and in fact, building up the natural resources. Thank you.
If you could hand it right to Heather behind you. With limited time, I think we want to kind of capture as many questions and then give Richard and Chip a final opportunity.
I'm Heather Diagnos. I work in the Office of Population and Reproductive Health at USAID. And I have just one comment and then a question. The one comment is to respond to Richard's comment about the fact that looking at population is too much of a long-term solution. And I'm just going to take issue with that because I work on projects that integrate population into conservation interventions. And I think it's foolish to say it's too long-term, so let's not address it. I think you can address it at the same time. And I think also when you get to the community level, and you talk to people, you realize that those are the people that have the most need and actually need to have that addressed as part of their basic access to health and also basic human right. Because in the Philippines, where I've done a lot of work, when you get to the community level, you see that those are the communities that are the most traditional, the most religious, and that have the most misinformation about family planning. And those are the ones who really need to have that access to information. So just a comment. And I have a question for Chip about the live reef food fish trade. I think one issue I would like to know a little bit more about is the role that corruption plays in a trade like this, which is international, extremely lucrative, and has high economic incentives. Because I did some work in the Philippines in a community where there was a live fish trade, live food fish trade. And I think the corruption undermined all attempts at management at all levels. I mean, the market mechanisms, the government mechanisms, and the community-based mechanisms. And I just don't see the solution to sort of overriding corruption in that issue. And I was hoping maybe you'd have some solutions as well.
One more hand that was in the back there. Why don't we get...
Yeah, I'm Robin Roberts with the Keystone Center. I was the lead facilitator for the Atlantic Large Whale Take Reduction Team and the Atlantic Trawl Gear Take Reduction Team for the National Marine Fisheries Service. So I don't have any international experience, but on the Atlantic seaboard I do. And I was curious about your perspective on the convening of something similar to a take reduction team to address problems like this, where the native fishermen are involved with policymakers in the development of mitigating strategies for their fisheries.
Thank you. I think we just have time. You guys can
Sure.
kind of pick and choose.
I'll just take a couple really quickly. As I think just in terms of what Maria said, Natsiolis, about policy reform indicators and having some kind of benchmarks and keeping it on the pressure. Well, I personally 100% agree. A. B, I know my colleagues at AID, that's one of the main points that we've been making in this. And I'm happy to say also, if you go on the Jeff website and look at the U.S. comments, which were submitted to the council or to the Secretariat after the council meeting, I think the very first point in our comments about the Coral Triangle Initiative makes that exact very same point. So we're definitely on board with you there. On the question of the role of corruption and how do you deal with it, well, it's kind of the tail wagging the dog. You're not going to solve it through live fish trade or fisheries, I think is the problem. It's a pervasive problem. In Indonesia, some of the main people involved in the illegal trade in Napoleon Wrasse after they put a restriction on it in 1995, below a certain size or above it, were people in the Navy. They were the ones. I mean, you get the forms in Hong Kong. I've seen the forms, which had been, signed a letter of passage or something from someone in the Navy, and even though it was clearly, the thing was filled with huge Napoleon Wrasse, 8 tons of it, so, that's a problem that goes across a lot of sectors. And, I agree, it can basically it makes it impossible to really gain the trust of communities or to make things work well if you have that there. And I'll leave you to the other points.
On the question about population control, if I led you to believe that it shouldn't be practiced, I'm sorry, because I think that it's important, but what I tried to point out was that we have immediate problems, and if you want people to begin to be able to begin to think about the resource, that we have to solve those problems, because the population control won't have any impact for another generation. You know, it's going to take a long time, maybe even longer. I think that they do have to be integrated, and that also answers the other question about, you know, integrated development programs. But the very important thing is also in terms of education and developing the economic infrastructure, that also is going to take almost a generation before it has any impact. You know, we're all extremely, I think, convinced that education is an important aspect of solving some of these problems. But right now, the immediate problem is getting food to these people in these communities, solving the problem of food security. And as I said before, and I fully believe it, until we solve that problem, they're not going to have conservation, they're not going to have fishery regulations as anything important in their minds. They want to feed their families. That may sound overly simplistic, but it's a fact. All you have to do is live in these communities to see that kind of a problem. The other point about the the alternative income and aquaculture and so on, and developing the matrix, the infrastructure, it is going to have to be something that's going to be appropriate. And through time, we've seen so many development projects that have failed, and the reasons for them are the failure are well known. I mean, the diffusion of innovation literature has been in existence for a half a century at least. And I see people making the same mistakes over and over and over again, be they in agriculture or in fisheries. They just don't learn from history. They just keep on repeating the same mistakes. I don't know if I missed anything in our response, but...
Well, I think perhaps the very last one, would either of you like to respond to whether the gentleman from Keystone with the Atlantic salmon model of facilitation and getting everyone at the table, whether that had prospects for application in some of the contexts that you're talking about?
Say something really quick. Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with that model, but I think that's at the core of trying to deal with some of these problems. To actually get the different stakeholders, the real stakeholders, not the people with a vague interest, but the ones who are living from a fishery or a marine resource in this case, to sit down together and figure out something which is going to work for everybody. The problem is that you're dealing with such imbalances of power and differences in culture often. It's not quite the same, I think, as dealing with it in our context here on the East Coast when you're talking about places like the Solomon Islands, for instance, where I spent some time, and they people are talking completely different languages. I mean, they're literally talking different languages, but they're talking different languages in the way that they perceive the world, the way they perceive resources, the way they perceive, who's in charge. What political group do they actually belong to? Are they part of the nation, or are they part of something else? Or, so it takes a lot more preparatory work and empowerment in bringing people to the same plane before they can really sit down and have a meaningful kind of a dialogue like that. I mean, I think it's the way we have to go, but it's just a lot further to get there, I think, in some of the contexts you're talking about in Southeast Asia.
I just have a word on that as well. It isn't that much different here. I'm working in the northeast coast on a National Marine Fisheries Service project, and I've done a lot of work with American Fisheries and National Marine Fisheries Service, and the fishermen speak different languages. The people who come to the table are frequently people who are more likely to speak the same language as the National Marine Fisheries Service. They're fishers who have already been empowered. But there's the great mass of fishermen who don't come to the table, who don't get involved, who continue to be not empowered in these communities. And so even here are attempts at trying to develop co-management in the northeastern part of the United States, in Maine, with lobster fishermen, by setting up these regions where they're trying to do co-management of the fishery, have a lot of problems involved. Because when NMFS thinks that it's talking to the fishermen, it's talking to a select group of fishermen who select themselves to come and talk with NMFS. It isn't the mass of fishers who don't attend these meetings. And I don't know how to solve that problem. I mean, that's something I've been struggling with.
That's terrific. Well, that universality of these challenges certainly is a good place to end. And I think the themes that we've heard today about the complexity and about the need to take on some of the core of the problems, but have this kind of broader integration will be, as I said, an issue that we pick up literally tomorrow as well at noon with this report that I think also goes to trying to address one of the problems that's been identified in this discussion and many others here at the center around efforts at integrated development that take into account conservation and health interventions, where in the case that we'll be talking about tomorrow from the Philippines, we actually do have some results of operations research that are looking at single sector versus integrated approaches. In in this case, seeing that the results are in fact statistically significant better